December 12, 2016, Detroit, Michigan, a city once known as the heart of America's automotive industry, is undergoing a renaissance.
The city of Detroit it's Motown, right? It's the Motor City.
Going back several years, we had, the auto crisis, the recession, we had this housing crisis.
Around 2016, Detroit started seeing better days. Companies started moving back. There was a lot of energy.
The city is really on the comeback now.
Longtime Detroit resident Conrad Green has lived through all the city's ups and downs. But nothing could prepare him for what he experienced on that cold Monday morning.
My wife and I were sitting, looking at television, looking at the news as we normally do. And my wife got a call.
Yes, speaking.
And it was the Genesis House. Genesis House was a transition house for homeless women.
Conrad's granddaughter, Nicole Smith, was temporarily living there with her son, Isaiah.
They're saying Nicole and Isaiah aren't at the home.
What? Hold on.
Just then, Conrad sees a shocking news bulletin flash across the TV screen.
Simultaneously, I saw Isaiah on the television.
The photo is shown of his great-grandchild, Isaiah, who's only 18 months old. He's instantly concerned.
According to the newscaster, Isaiah had been found wandering the streets of Detroit's West Side all on his own.
Thankfully, the young boy is now safe.
Isaiah was dropped off at a fire station by a Good Samaritan.
Conrad immediately springs into action.
So he contacts the local police precinct that's holding Isaiah, and he says, hey, this is my great-grandchild. He rushes down there.
Along the way, Conrad and his wife try to reach their granddaughter, Nicole, by phone.
They're frantically trying to get a hold of her, and they can't.
I continued to call Nicole, and I used the firm granddad voice. Nicole, call me. She never did.
News quickly spreads to the rest of the family, who were also unable to reach Nicole.
I got the call, and I'm like, what is going on? Y'all seen Nicole? I'm like, no.
I'm like, this ain't normal. It's something wrong.
Nicole is not going to abandon her kids. She's not going to leave them on the streets nowhere.
Everyone's asking, where is Nicole?
Detroit native Nicole Smith was used to overcoming hardships.
She developed problems when she was a baby. She had seizures. She limped on her right side, and she didn't really have full strength or use on her left side.
But Nicole displayed remarkable courage in the face of her numerous health challenges.
She was not an oh, woe is me person. No, she did take it in stride.
Nicole was very vibrant. She was bubbly.
Nicole is a very caring, loving, family-oriented young lady.
Her cousins was her friends. You know what I'm saying? She loved her music. She was funny.
Nicole also loved her longtime boyfriend, Damian Carver, and the couple wanted nothing more than to start a family together.
Well, Nicole was interested in being a mother.
And in the fall of 2007, her dream came true.
She got pregnant and had her first daughter, Kilana.
Tragically, though, heartbreak was on the horizon.
Kilana only lived for 5 months. She ended up dying of Cribb's death.
It was a devastating moment for the young couple, but in time, they decided to try again.
She ended up having a son 2 years after Kilana passed. Then the next year, she had a daughter, and then she had a youngest girl.
She was a good mother. She did anything and did the world for her kids.
However, when the couple's middle child began experiencing medical issues, it put further stress on their relationship.
They both were having problems with fully taking care of the 3 children. Then it was just really a lot for both of them. They needed help.
Family members took in the couple's children while they worked on building a stable home.
Their relationship, it was being tumultuous and what have you.
Nicole and Damian eventually split. And around the same time, Nicole's mother passed away.
This was another hard time for Nicole.
She didn't have a job or a home of her own. She was suffering mentally and physically. That meant Nicole was especially vulnerable.
Although I and the rest of the family was a source of support for her, she was still having difficulties. She ended up getting pregnant and having Isaiah. And she didn't know who the father was.
However, Isaiah's birth in 2015 proved to be a turning point in Nicole's life.
Isaiah, his first words were mama.
Isaiah was a mama's boy. Anywhere that Nicole would go, he was on her tail.
They went and lived in the Genesis house, a transition house for homeless women. Genesis house was trying to help her get her own home, and she was in the process of it. She was actually supposed to move there maybe like within a month.
The more strides Nicole took towards building a happier life, the more she wanted someone to share it with.
Nicole was putting herself out there. She was starting to date again.
She loved her man. The ones she deal with, she gonna try to go all out to do what she gotta do to make him happy.
She was looking for love.
But now, a breaking news report has seized her family's attention.
Isaiah had been found on the street. Well, I got up right away and went to the police station.
When Conrad and his wife arrive at the station, they're relieved to be reunited with their great-grandson.
And Isaiah saw me and said, "Granddad, Granddad," and ran to me. And, I picked him up and held him. And so, where's your mommy? Where's your mommy? He didn't say anything.
Conrad tells the police no one has been able to reach his granddaughter Nicole since learning of her disappearance.
Something's not right.
And I said, well, this is more than a missing child. This is a missing person.
Let us know if you haven't heard from her about tomorrow morning, okay? Yes, sir. All right. Please.
Come on, sir.
As night settles over the city, Nicole's family is beginning to fear the worst.
I kept calling her the whole night.
Did she have a health emergency? Did someone attack her?
She ain't never did that one, just disappeared, never. I knew something was wrong.
The morning after her 18-month-old son was found wandering the streets of West Detroit, police officially declare 33-year-old Nicole Smith a missing person.
Her family had been trying to contact her nonstop for the last 24 hours.
The biggest question is, how does this one-year-old child become separated from their mother?
When detectives speak with Nicole's grandfather, that's exactly what they want to find out.
When was the last time you saw Nicole?
Sunday afternoon. She and Isaiah came over to the house.
Nicole always visited us on Sundays, and I would pick her up at Genesis. She would come and spend a few hours with us, and then I'd take her back home.
However, Conrad says when he picked Nicole and Isaiah up that afternoon, something was troubling her.
Hey. Nicole said, "Granddad, I'm gonna do something, and I don't know if I should do it or not." And so she had been being private around that time. So I said, well, Nicole, we brought you up right. You know how to make good decisions. And if you need some help, let us know, because we'll help you.
If you have any questions or need help with anything, just let us know, okay?
Thanks, Granddad.
You're welcome.
So anyway, we got to the house, and Nicole did her normal thing. "Hi, Granny, how you doing?" Went through all of that.
Leaving Nicole and Isaiah with his wife, Conrad subsequently went out to run an errand. But when he returned, his granddaughter was gone.
When I got back to the house, Nicole wasn't there, and Isaiah wasn't there either.
Did Nicole and Isaiah leave?
No, they're not downstairs.
He went upstairs, where Nicole at. My grandma was like, she downstairs. We was like, no, she ain't downstairs.
The plan was for me to drive her and Isaiah back to Genesis' house. She didn't say anything about getting picked up.
And that's something that is really one of our rules. You need to tell us when you're leaving the house. It's just for knowledge of where you're at in case something's happened to you.
Do you have any idea who might have picked Nicole up?
I really don't. I'm always the one who drives her.
The family revealed Nicole suffered from seizures and she had some physical disabilities.
It's possible that something bad has happened medically. Maybe not even something criminal.
Still, Conrad can't get that last conversation he had with Nicole out of his mind.
I felt actually a sense of dread because she told me that she might be doing something that she didn't know if she should do or not. And so my mind went to, I wonder, did she do what she thought she shouldn't do?
Detroit investigators share the family's concerns and immediately get to work trying to track Nicole down.
Nicole had been missing since December the 11th, so that would be our starting point, and we would work backward from there.
They start calling hospitals. They check homeless shelters, and nobody had seen her.
We go back to the fire station because that is where Isaiah was turned over to the battalion chief there and the firefighter. So those two individuals were interviewed.
According to the firemen, a man walked into the station the previous afternoon with Isaiah in tow.
They're told that the man who dropped off Isaiah is a black man in his 30s.
He said he was on his way somewhere and observed this child wandering in the street alone.
I seen this kid just wandering the block, not a parent in sight. I thought maybe you guys could help.
He was instantly concerned, and so he picked up Isaiah, took him to the fire department.
He provided the name of Robert Johnson, and also at that time provided a telephone number.
That's the number he gave us.
We'll give it a shot.
Okay.
They want to talk to this Good Samaritan just in case there's some additional information, something he may have seen to help them with their investigation.
But when detectives reach out to Robert, they run into a problem.
They call the number, a young female answers. They ask about Robert Johnson, and she says, I don't know Robert Johnson. I had never heard of this person. Why would a Good Samaritan leave them the wrong telephone number?
In the mind of a detective, that's a clue.
This Good Samaritan may not be such a Good Samaritan after all.
"24 hours after Nicole Smith disappeared, Detroit detectives have just made an unsettling discovery about the man who claimed to have found her son.
He presented himself as Robert Johnson, just a Good Samaritan, who happened to see this child wandering about with no adults in sight and took it upon himself, in a sense, to rescue the child.
But now investigators are wondering if this Robert Johnson is really who he says he is.
Come to find out, he's given a fake phone number.
We begin to conduct our queries to try to identify who this individual was.
Unfortunately, there were no cameras at the fire station. They instantly go back to the family asking, have you ever heard of Robert Johnson?
We was just all at home trying to just figure out who it could have been, who is this person, because we never met the person.
Fortunately, Nicole's cousin Ashley comes forward with information that she believes could help the investigation.
It was actually like my daughter who actually started coming up with suggestions because they was real kind of close.
There was this guy that she was talking to on the phone a lot.
Do you know his name?
No, she never told me his name.
She was happy. She just on the phone, she lollygagging.
But Ashley's interactions with her mysterious male friend weren't all positive.
I watched my cousin call his phone from sun up to sundown one day. He was sitting in that dining room and kept redialing that number. I said, Nicole, what is you doing? Why did you keep dialing the number?
What are you doing? Why do you keep calling them?
Because he's not answering.
She said he was supposed to come over or come get me, something like this. I'm like, okay. But she kept calling that phone. I'm talking about she was furious, mad. That's the first time I ever saw her like that. Mad.
More recently, Ashley says Nicole had made a connection with an older man she met online.
I told them that she was talking about this old man that she had just met.
She didn't tell me his name either, but I know she was planning on meeting him in person.
The old man should message him only on Facebook. She'd sit in the dining room, set her phone on the charger, message him.
To investigators, it sounds like a potential lead.
Now, the police are concerned because we know that social media, Facebook, well, that's breeding ground for predators. So they're wondering, did she meet up with the wrong guy?
To detectives' surprise, Ashley says this wouldn't be the first time Nicole has fallen prey to a predatory man.
She done got raped at a bus stop before.
It was a little over a year ago.
On August 17th, 2015, Nicole was at a bus stop around 7:30 in the morning in front of her transitional housing.
She felt something hit her in the head. And when she woke up, she was in the alley and she had been raped.
She called me the morning that it happened and she was crying. I said, Nicole, go to the hospital. And so she went and she did go get the rape kit done.
Nicole is not able to really give a good description of the person who assaulted her, but what police are able to determine is that this person left semen.
That DNA sample was sent to the state crime lab for processing. But more than a year later, Nicole's attacker still hadn't been identified.
It's not uncommon for states to have a long backlog of untested rape kits, and at the time of Nicole's disappearance, her rape kit still had not been processed.
After speaking with Ashley, investigators contact the state crime lab to request a rush on Nicole's rape kit.
Whoever this individual was that raped Nicole could also be involved in her disappearance.
Detectives also file a subpoena for Nicole's cell phone records, and one number immediately stands out to them.
Once we received the data from the phone company, we were able to see that there were 77 telephone calls placed between Robert Autry and Nicole Smith.
Could Robert Autry and Robert Johnson be the same person?
Not only have they had contact via phone, but also on Facebook.
This began to form a picture in our minds. Based on my line of work, there can't be too many coincidences.
They're anxious to find this Robert Autry. Does he know where Nicole is?
Thanks to Nicole Smith's cell phone records, Detroit police have just identified a person of interest in the 33-year-old mother's disappearance.
She had been in near constant contact with this individual, this Robert Autry, in the days leading up to her disappearance.
Now the question is, who is Robert Autry? They wonder if maybe this Robert Autry is Robert Johnson, the Good Samaritan who dropped off her youngest child at the fire department.
Phone records show that Robert Autry last called Nicole on December 11th, one day before Isaiah was turned over to firefighters.
After December the 11th, he hadn't placed any more calls to Nicole. That's not normal.
Investigators uncover more troubling information when they start digging into Robert Autry's past.
While he was a high school student in 2003, he actually assaulted another student.
He's 16 years old, and he is accused of assaulting a mentally challenged girl.
He lured her into an abandoned building and raped her.
Ultimately, he's prosecuted, he does a plea deal, but because he's a juvenile, he doesn't receive any substantial sentence, but he is put on the sex offenders list.
Unfortunately, though, that wasn't enough to teach Robert a lesson.
It doesn't stop there. What the police also learned is that in 2011, Robert Autry assaults another woman. This young lady is recovering from drug addiction. She's at home one night. She says that someone breaks in, comes through the window, and he proceeds to assault and rape her.
Eventually, that DNA comes back as Robert Autry.
It began to look like this guy is a predator.
Records show that law enforcement tried to prosecute Robert again, this time as an adult. But the case fell apart when the victim refused to cooperate.
There are many reasons why someone may choose not to go forward. You know, it's traumatic.
So what that meant was that Robert walked away scot-free.
The striking similarities between the alleged rape in 2011 and Nicole's 2015 bus stop assault aren't lost on police.
This is clearly a guy who was targeting vulnerable women.
And when detectives send Robert Autry's 2011 mugshot to the firemen who helped Isaiah to safety, it's a match.
They were able to confirm, yes, this is the man who dropped off Isaiah. It's the same guy who claimed he was Robert Johnson.
Now that his true identity is confirmed, detectives hope they'll have an easier time tracking down their #1 suspect.
The police are looking for Robert. They're questioning people in the community.
They subpoenaed his phone records, and at the same time, they continued to reach out to Nicole's circle of family and friends.
When police speak to Nicole's best friend, Melanie, she says Nicole recently told her about a new man she was seeing, a man detectives now suspect is Robert Autry.
She was always either talking about him or talking to him on the phone. He had a hook, line, and sinker.
She just kept saying, my boyfriend, my boyfriend, my boyfriend. And I'm like, okay, I need to meet this boyfriend. And she said, you will meet him.
Only Melanie says that never happened. Instead, Nicole's new man seemed to intentionally keep his distance.
She had Robert come over to my house to pick her up one day. And it was kind of peculiar how he would not come to my door and he parked backwards where I couldn't see his face.
It was weird.
Melanie says in the days ahead, Nicole also started exhibiting strange behaviors with money.
She had asked me for about $200. And I said, why? She said, well, I gotta pay my rent at the shelter. I said, you already paid it. She said, well, I was behind. I said, okay. So I gave her the $200. And then a couple days later, she called me and said, well, I need probably like $50. And she gave me another excuse.
I think she was just doing what he told her to do.
That wasn't like Nicole, because Nicole always paid her rent and she always paid her bills.
Nicole received Social Security benefits, so she received money every month. She received a bridge card.
This was a government assistance card that Nicole used to buy food.
Well, thank you for coming in.
Detectives decide to follow the financial breadcrumbs by filing a subpoena for Nicole's financial records.
All of her financial, dealings had stopped when she disappeared, except authorities find that her bridge card is still in use.
Someone is taking Nicole's bridge card and using it at gas stations and other convenience stores within the area.
They know it was used at a supermarket and a liquor store. They're able to pull surveillance from those stores.
I started watching the video.
Wait. Stop there. Freeze that frame.
And there he is. It's Robert Autry.
In Detroit, Michigan, 30-year-old Robert Autry has emerged as the prime suspect in Nicole Smith's disappearance after being caught on camera using her stolen food stamps card.
We find Robert Autry taking Nicole's bridge card and using it at gas stations and other convenience stores within the area.
With a bolo out on Robert, detectives circulate his photo among Nicole's family members. And Nicole's cousin Ashley immediately recognizes him.
Like one day I went to the store with her. She wanted to walk by herself. I said, no, I'm gonna go with you. And that was the first time I ever saw the man. Hey, how you doing? I'm her cousin,
Hey.
Hey, what's up?
How are you?
I'm great. Hey, so did you get that message I sent you?
Yeah, I got it.
At the time, Ashley didn't realize this was the same man her cousin had been talking to on the phone for weeks.
She got him some money or whatever, then he gave her a hug, and then he walked back.
What did you just give him?
$200.
Are you serious?
It's not that serious. He said
That's
he
your
needed it.
money.
I don't want to talk about it. Just let it go.
I just felt like it wasn't right. I don't feel like he liked her. I felt like he was using her.
It became apparent that he was targeting her, so to speak.
And when investigators get their hands on Robert's phone records, they uncover another bombshell. Nicole wasn't the only woman in Robert's life.
His current girlfriend was living in that same transitional home that Nicole Smith was currently living at. He was essentially siphoning what Nicole was given to care for herself and her son, for his girlfriend, and for their children.
The investigators now have enough evidence to secure an arrest warrant for Robert, but they still have to find him.
Days go by without any leads on Robert's whereabouts. Until December 19th, when Nicole has been missing a full week.
They get a call from an anonymous person who tells them that Robert Autry is staying at an apartment building in the area.
As he's leaving, they take him into custody, and lo and behold, what does he have in his pocket? Nicole's bridge card.
Robert Autry was brought to Detroit Police Headquarters. There, myself and Officer James McDonald conducted an interrogation of Mr. Autry.
Robert, I'm not going to beat around the bush with you here. We're concerned about Nicole's well-being, and her phone records indicate that you two did talk.
So what?
Robert Autry denies having any kind of real relationship with Nicole other than a friendship.
So you two weren't in a romantic relationship?
Mr. Autry claims that he did not see Nicole on December the 11th.
But as investigators lay out the evidence, Robert starts to sweat.
He knew it didn't look good if he was the last one to see her.
We have two witnesses who can positively ID you as the man who dropped off Isaiah at the fire department.
When confronted with the truth, Mr. Autry had to change his story.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I did see her that day.
He admits that she had called him for a ride.
He says to police that, look, he went to pick up Nicole from her grandfather's house to take her back to her transitional housing, that when he gets there, he drops her off.
It's a story the investigators are easily able to poke holes in.
So if you dropped off Nicole, why did you take her son to the fire department? And what's with the fake name?
Why does it matter?
To say the least, this interview conducted with Robert Autry was filled with lies, inconsistencies, information that he could not explain. When confronted, he would just provide an answer that frankly didn't make sense.
What were you doing with Nicole's bridge card?
I was borrowing.
He said that she gave him the bridge card and that he had permission to use it, and he used it with her consent.
Robert, where's Nicole? Her family deserves to know the truth.
I didn't do nothing to her.
He's adamant that he had nothing to do with it. He dropped her off and he went about his business.
But detectives are convinced that isn't true.
Plainly put, Mr. Autry was lying.
They are convinced Robert Autry knows something about Nicole's disappearance. Unfortunately, though, they can't prove it.
This is such a difficult spot for investigators to be in. Everything's circumstantial.
When you don't have a body, when you don't have a person, it's very difficult to convict. It's very difficult to bring charges.
And so they need more evidence.
Without any proof connecting Robert to Nicole's disappearance, police are forced to release him. When the news reaches Nicole's family, they're stunned.
I understood if you don't have enough evidence, but that was a hard situation.
I was mad, you know.
Where's Nicole? That, for me, was the goal.
But the more time that passes, the harder it is to believe Nicole will ever be found.
I used to get off work and go searching for her on my own, going through railroad tracks, going under bridges, going to abandoned houses.
We were looking everywhere. We were just trying to figure out, where was she at?
Days go by, Days turns into weeks, weeks turn into months.
Finally, in December of 2018, when Nicole has been missing a full 2 years, there's a new development that reignites the investigation.
Police get a big break in Nicole's case.
Mr. Autry had found himself arrested on an unrelated matter.
Robert Autry tells prosecutors, "Give me a plea deal and I will give you new information about Nicole."
He says, "I can tell you where her body is."
Two years after Nicole Smith went missing, Detroit investigators' #1 suspect in her disappearance has just been arrested on an unrelated case.
It's December 2018, and Robert Autry is arrested on another assaultive case.
He is once again accused of rape, and he's facing a life sentence.
He realizes this is a case he can't beat, and so he's very afraid about spending the rest of his life in prison.
In hopes of avoiding a life sentence, Robert reaches out to prosecutors.
Mr. Autry offers the information that, "Oh, I can tell you where Nicole is."
Nicole's poor family has been waiting for answers for 2 years, and now Robert Autry, when faced with a life sentence, tells prosecutors, "Give me a plea deal, give me a lighter sentence, and I will give you new information about Nicole."
And so they do. They make a plea deal with him.
He is able to plead to a reduced second-degree murder.
Mr. Autry provided exact information as to where Nicole could be found.
The location is an abandoned apartment building in West Detroit.
Members of the Detroit Police Department responded to the area in which he had indicated.
They go inside and head to the basement. They find under a bunch of garbage a big black bag.
We made the unfortunate discovery, the remains of Nicole Smith.
Oh my God.
Obviously, at this point, the body is very badly decomposed.
It's a difficult scene to stomach, even for seasoned law enforcement officers.
To find her dead just sickened me. The state of disrepair and just the garbage everywhere, the dampness, the gloom of just this building. You know, how dare you?
The medical examiners ruled Nicole's cause of death to be strangulation.
To add insult to injury, Nicole's body was just a few blocks away from her family all this time.
She's right, like 8 blocks from my house. I done passed this building and she's right here at the building I done passed every day. That's crazy.
8 blocks. I was crying, like my cousin gone.
I remember Granddaddy Greenlee calling me. He said they found Nicole's body. I remember screaming.
Apart from Nicole's location, Robert refuses to give up any more details of the crime. But even without a full confession, investigators are able to form a theory of how Nicole died.
Robert Autry obviously is someone who's addicted to power, control. He's looking for people that he can assault who are vulnerable. He's purposely targeting those with mental and physical disabilities.
Robert Autry was taking money from Nicole. He used her.
The authorities suspect that Nicole had begun to catch on to Robert's scheme.
You don't want to even answer her calls, and so after so long, a woman gonna get fed up, and she gonna cut you off.
Maybe the last conversation Nicole had with her grandfather was alluding to this potential confrontation. Maybe she was finally going to cut Robert out of her life.
Based on Robert's own statement, investigators believe he picked Nicole up from her grandfather's house on the afternoon of December 12th, 2016.
Hey, so you got that money I asked for?
No, I'm not giving you any more money.
What you mean?
You already took all my money. Get a job.
Nicole, she's real feisty. So he might have said something to her in the car and she gonna smack back.
She's decided to walk away, to stand up for herself, and to not deal with this abusive relationship.
She must have got right back at him with something he said. Maybe he just flipped out.
Go be a man.
Overcome with rage, detectives speculate that Robert wrapped his hands around Nicole's throat.
Get off me!
What happened?
He chokes her to death, and it all happens in front of Isaiah.
He's a monster. How could you take somebody's life in front of their child?
Once Nicole was dead, Robert realized he had to get rid of her body.
Now he has to cover his tracks. And so he takes Isaiah to the fire department. He takes her remains, he puts it into the basement of this apartment building.
To find her in this grave, in this tomb of a building, this is something that undoubtedly will remain with me for the rest of my life.
But before Robert is sentenced for his crimes, a new piece of evidence emerges that casts his actions in an even more despicable light.
A year before Nicole was murdered, she had been raped by an unknown assailant. That rape kit was eventually processed by the Michigan State Lab.
There was his semen in that rape kit.
I don't believe Nicole knew that Robert was the one who raped her.
He raped her before, and you still sought her out.
The fact that this man victimized her twice is so disgusting. He's pure evil.
On January 15th, 2019, Robert is sentenced to 15 to 30 years in prison as part of his plea deal.
He deserved what he got. He deserved more than what he got.
I just felt like, no, that's not enough. That's not enough time.
The way you tortured her, I feel like you should go through the same torture.
Robert is never charged in connection with Nicole's 2015 sexual assault.
That was very, very, very sickening to me. That they was only giving him charged with her murder, not the rape, because they couldn't detect it until after she was missing.
To honor Nicole, that same month, her friends and family hold a vigil at the abandoned building where her body was found.
We got the visual together because we wanted her soul to rest. And a lot of people turned out, and it felt good. It felt so good.
I was happy and I was sad at the same time. I was happy that we was able to close that chapter. I was sad because that was my best friend.
We couldn't let that building stay there. My dad worked very hard on getting that building torn out.
We was praising the Lord. The very joyous time. We were all happy to see the building go.
Today, Nicole's son Isaiah is being raised by her cousin, Shannon.
He's doing real good in school. He's bright. He's happy.
Her other 3 kids stayed with their father's family.
I wish she was here. I wish she was here to say I love you one more time, because I never got a chance to tell her I love her before she left.
Sexual assault is never okay. If you or someone you love has experienced sexual assault, there is help available. Call the National Sexual Assault Hotline at 1-800-656-HOPE.
On a warm September night in 1977, the streets of San Francisco's Chinatown were still alive. The narrow sidewalks beneath the glowing signs were filled with people moving between restaurants, shops, and small family businesses that had stood for decades. The smell of roasted meat drifted through the streets. Voices in different languages blended together. Families shared late meals after long days of work. Tourists wandered through the neighborhood, fascinated by the lights, the food, and the history hidden behind every doorway. For many people, Chinatown was a place of tradition. A place where generations of families had built new lives after arriving in America. Behind the colorful storefronts and crowded streets was a community held together by family, culture, and survival. But beneath that familiar surface, another world existed. A world where loyalty was measured by fear. Where respect was earned through violence. Where young men carried the weight of old grudges and new rivalries. By the summer of 1977, Chinatown had become a battlefield hidden in plain sight. Two rival gangs, the Watching and the Joe Boys, had spent years fighting for control, influence, and reputation. Their conflict was not a single argument, or one isolated incident. It was a slow-burning war built from revenge, pride, and the belief that every attack demanded another response. And on one September night, that war would explode inside a place where nobody expected danger to arrive. A restaurant. A place where people came to eat. A place where families sat together. A place where strangers believed they were safe. The Golden Dragon restaurant was not a battlefield. It was not a street corner where gang members settled their disputes. It was not a hidden location where criminals met in secret. It was a public place filled with ordinary people. People who had nothing to do with the war happening outside. But at approximately 2:40 in the morning on September 4, 1977, several masked men walked through its doors carrying weapons. They did not come looking for food. They did not come looking for money. They came looking for revenge. Their target was supposed to be members of the Watching gang, their longtime rivals. The plan was simple in the minds of those who created it: find their enemies, attack them, and send a message. But within moments, that plan became something far darker. The men who entered the Golden Dragon were not able to separate their anger from the lives surrounding them. The bullets did not recognize gang colors. They did not recognize enemies. They did not recognize innocence. They tore through everyone in their path. In less than a minute, the Golden Dragon transformed from a restaurant into a scene of terror. People who had been eating moments earlier were suddenly running for their lives. Tables were overturned. Customers desperately searched for somewhere to hide. Some people froze in disbelief, unable to understand what was happening. Others dropped to the floor, hoping that staying still would keep them alive. When the gunfire stopped, the damage was already done. 5 people were dead. 11 others were wounded. And the most devastating truth emerged afterward. The people who died were not the intended targets. The gang members the attackers came to kill were still alive. The victims were ordinary people, who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were workers finishing another long night. Customers enjoying a meal. Friends spending time together. People who had woken up that day with plans for tomorrow. Plans that would never happen. The Golden Dragon Massacre became one of the most shocking acts of violence in San Francisco's history. It exposed a side of Chinatown that many outsiders never knew existed. The neighborhood that many viewed as peaceful and traditional was also struggling with a hidden crisis involving youth gangs, underground conflicts, and cycles of revenge. But behind the headlines and police reports were human stories. The story of families who received devastating news in the middle of the night. The story of investigators who entered a scene filled with unanswered questions. The story of a community forced to confront the violence growing around them. And the story of young men who believed they were fighting for honor, only to create a tragedy that would follow them for the rest of their lives. To understand how the Golden Dragon Massacre happened, we have to look beyond the shooting itself. Because this was not a random explosion of violence. It was the final result of years of tension building beneath the surface. It began with 2 rival groups of young men searching for identity and power in a rapidly changing city. The Watching had become one of the most recognized gangs in Chinatown. They had influence, connections, and a reputation that made others fear them. The Joe Boys, originally connected to the same world, eventually became their rivals. The split created a dangerous rivalry. What began as competition turned into hatred. Every confrontation created another reason for retaliation. Each side believed they had been wronged. Each side believed they had something to prove. And with every act of violence, the possibility of peace became more distant. By 1977, the conflict had already claimed lives. One death led to another. One attack demanded revenge. One act of revenge created another wound. The cycle continued until the death of Felix Huey, a 16-year-old member of the Joe Boys. Felix was killed during a shootout at the Pingyuan housing complex on July 4, 1977. To the Joe Boys, his death was not simply a loss. It became a symbol. A reason to strike back. A moment that demanded action. Within the world of gang culture, emotions often become more powerful than logic. A fallen member becomes more than a person. They become a representation of loyalty, pride, and reputation. The question was no longer whether revenge would come. The only question was how far it would go. And that answer came 2 months later, at the Golden Dragon restaurant. The attackers believed they were entering the restaurant to punish their enemies. Instead, they created a tragedy that would forever change the lives of dozens of innocent people. They wanted to send a message. But the message they sent was not about power. It was about the cost of violence. It showed that when revenge takes control, nobody is truly safe. Not a family sitting together. Not a restaurant worker finishing a shift. Not a stranger who simply happened to walk through the wrong door at the wrong moment. The Golden Dragon Massacre was not only a story about gang warfare. It was a story about consequences. About how hatred spreads. About how young men searching for respect can become trapped in a world where violence becomes the only language they understand. And most importantly, it was a story about the innocent people who paid the highest price for a war they never chose. On that September night, 5 lives ended inside the Golden Dragon. Their names became part of a tragedy that San Francisco would never forget. But before the investigation, before the arrests, before the courtroom battles, there was only one thing that mattered. 5 people walked into a restaurant expecting an ordinary night. They never knew they were walking into history. And they never had the chance to walk back out. To understand the tragedy that unfolded inside the Golden Dragon restaurant, it is necessary to understand the place where it happened. San Francisco's Chinatown was more than just a neighborhood. It was a symbol. For generations of Chinese immigrants, it represented a place of survival, identity, and hope. Behind its famous gates and crowded streets was a community built by people who had crossed oceans, faced discrimination, and worked through hardship to create a future for themselves and their children. During the day, Chinatown appeared vibrant and welcoming. The streets were filled with merchants opening their shops, elderly residents walking slowly along sidewalks, children heading to school, and workers preparing restaurants for another busy evening. Colorful signs hung above narrow buildings. Small markets displayed fresh vegetables and seafood. Families gathered in restaurants where recipes had been passed down from one generation to the next. To outsiders, Chinatown was a place of culture. But for those who lived there, especially during the 1970s, there was another reality hidden beneath the surface. The neighborhood was changing. The older generation had built Chinatown through patience, discipline, and sacrifice. Many had arrived in America with limited opportunities. They worked long hours in restaurants, laundries, and small businesses. They saved money, supported their families, and created a community where their children could have better lives. But the younger generation faced a different struggle. Many young Chinese Americans grew up between two worlds. At home, they lived within traditional family expectations. Outside, they faced the challenges of American streets, where identity, acceptance, and belonging were often complicated. For some teenagers, especially those growing up in poverty or unstable environments, gangs offered something they felt they could not find elsewhere. A sense of family. A sense of protection. A sense of importance. The streets offered young men a place where they could earn recognition quickly. A person who felt invisible could suddenly become someone others feared. But that recognition came with a dangerous price. By the 1970s, Chinatown had become home to several youth gangs. These groups were not always organized like traditional criminal organizations. Many began as neighborhood groups, formed by teenagers looking for friendship and protection. But over time, rivalries developed. Small disagreements became personal conflicts. Personal conflicts became violence. And violence created a culture where revenge became expected. Among the most powerful groups were the Watching and the Joe Boys. The Watching had established a strong presence in Chinatown. They were known throughout the community and had developed a reputation for intimidation and control. Their name carried weight. For rivals, challenging Watching meant challenging one of the strongest groups in the area. The Joe Boys emerged from the same environment, but eventually became one of their greatest opponents. The rivalry between the two groups was not simply about territory. It was about reputation. In the world of gangs, reputation could determine survival. A gang that appeared weak could become a target. A member who failed to respond to an attack could be viewed as someone who did not deserve respect. This created a dangerous mindset. Violence was not only used as a weapon. It became a message. A way to communicate power. A way to prove loyalty. And once that mentality took hold, every act of violence created pressure for another. The problem was that revenge rarely stayed between the people involved. It spread. A fight between two individuals could become a conflict between entire groups. A single death could become a reason for retaliation. The people who suffered most were often not the ones who started the conflict. By 1977, the tension between Watching and Joe Boys had reached a dangerous level. The city of San Francisco was experiencing a period of change. Crime was a growing concern, and authorities were struggling to deal with gang activity that operated quietly within communities. Chinatown, like many urban neighborhoods at the time, faced challenges that were not always visible to outsiders. Many residents knew there were problems. Some heard rumors about fights. Some saw groups of young men gathering on street corners. Some noticed the fear in people's voices when certain names were mentioned. But many ordinary residents tried to continue their lives. They worked. They raised families. They ran businesses. They hoped the violence would remain separate from them. They believed that if they stayed away from gang conflicts, the danger would stay away from them too. The Golden Dragon massacre would prove how fragile that belief was. Because on the night of September 3, 1977, the people inside the restaurant were not gang members searching for trouble. They were simply people living their lives. The restaurant itself had become a familiar gathering place. The Golden Dragon was located in the heart of Chinatown, surrounded by the energy and history of the neighborhood. Like many restaurants in the area, it served as more than a place to eat. It was a meeting point. A place where friends gathered after work. A place where families celebrated special occasions. A place where tourists experienced a piece of San Francisco's Chinese heritage. Nobody entering that restaurant that night expected violence. Nobody imagined that the conflict between two street gangs would reach inside those walls. But the atmosphere of Chinatown in the 1970s was shaped by contradictions. It was a place filled with tradition and hope, but also frustration and hidden conflicts. It was a neighborhood where parents worked hard to protect their children, while some young people searched for belonging in dangerous places. It was a community trying to move forward while carrying the weight of problems that had been building for years. The members of Joe Boys and Wat Ching were not born into violence. They were young men shaped by their surroundings, their experiences and their choices. Understanding that does not excuse what happened. It does not reduce responsibility. But it helps explain how a group of teenagers and young adults could become trapped in a cycle where revenge felt more important than human life. The tragedy of the Golden Dragon did not begin when the first shot was fired. It began years earlier. It began with small conflicts that were ignored. With anger that was allowed to grow. With a belief that fear could create respect. And by the summer of 1977, that belief had reached a deadly point. The death of Felix Huey became the spark. A 16-year-old was gone. A gang wanted revenge. And somewhere in the minds of those planning retaliation, the lives of innocent strangers became invisible. That was the danger of gang warfare. The enemy was always the focus. The consequences were always forgotten. As September approached, the streets of Chinatown continued as normal. Restaurants opened. Customers arrived. Families ate together. People laughed. People talked. People made plans for the future. But beneath that ordinary rhythm, something darker was moving. A decision had already been made. A group of young men had convinced themselves that violence was the only answer. They believed they were preparing a strike against their enemies. They did not understand that they were preparing one of the darkest nights in San Francisco's history. The Golden Dragon restaurant was about to become the place where Chinatown's hidden war finally became impossible to ignore. And the people inside would become the unwilling witnesses to a tragedy that would echo for decades, before the headlines. Before the police reports. Before the courtroom arguments and the search for those responsible. There were people. People with families. People with dreams. People who woke up on September 4, 1977, believing it would be another ordinary day. They were not soldiers in a gang war. They were not involved in the conflict between the Joe Boys and Wat Ching. They did not know the names of the people who hated each other. They did not understand the history of the violence building around them. They were simply human beings who happened to be inside the Golden Dragon restaurant when hatred entered through the door. The tragedy of the Golden Dragon massacre is often remembered through numbers. 5 dead. 11 injured. More than 20 bullets fired. Less than a minute of violence. But numbers cannot explain the true weight of what happened. A number does not show a mother waiting for her child to come home. A number does not show a family receiving a phone call that changes their lives forever. A number does not show the empty chair left behind at a dinner table. Behind every statistic was a person whose story ended without warning. The victims of the Golden Dragon were ordinary people caught in an extraordinary moment of violence. Their lives did not begin that night. And they should not be remembered only because of how they died. They should be remembered because of how they lived. At the center of this tragedy was the painful reality that the attackers had entered the restaurant searching for enemies, but the people they found were mostly strangers. The gunmen believed they knew their target. They believed they were striking against a rival gang. But in the confusion and chaos of the attack, the distinction between enemy and innocent disappeared. The bullets did not follow the plan. They did not stop when they reached people who had nothing to do with the conflict. They did not recognize the difference between a gang member and a customer sitting at a table. And when the shooting ended, the world of several families changed forever. One of the victims was a restaurant employee. Like countless workers in Chinatown, he was simply doing his job. Restaurant workers often lived invisible lives. They arrived before customers, prepared everything behind the scenes, served meals, cleaned tables, and worked long hours so others could enjoy a few moments together. For many immigrant communities, restaurants were more than businesses. They were places of survival. They provided jobs. They supported families. They connected generations. The people working inside those restaurants carried the hopes of their families every day. That night, one worker entered the Golden Dragon expecting nothing more than another shift. He did not know that a conflict between two gangs would reach him. He did not know that his workplace would become a crime scene. He did not know that his final hours would become part of one of San Francisco's most painful memories. The other victims were customers. Some had come to enjoy a late meal. Some were residents of the area. Some may have been visitors experiencing Chinatown for the first time. Their reasons for being there were ordinary. That was what made the tragedy so devastating. They were not chasing danger. They were not looking for conflict. They were not making choices that placed them in the middle of a criminal world. They were simply present. A restaurant at 2 o'clock in the morning might seem like an unusual place to some people, but in a city neighborhood, life continues at different hours. Workers finish late shifts. Friends meet after work. Families spend time together. Travelers search for food after exploring the city. The Golden Dragon was a place where those different lives crossed for a brief moment. Nobody inside knew that their paths would intersect with history. The people sitting at the tables that night represented the everyday life of Chinatown. They represented the community the gangs were supposed to belong to. They represented the families, workers, and neighbors who had built the neighborhood over generations. And yet, they became victims of a conflict they never chose. The emotional impact of the massacre was not limited to those who lost their lives. The survivors carried their own trauma. Some watched friends fall. Some saw strangers collapse. Some remembered the confusion of those first seconds when nobody understood what was happening. A restaurant filled with conversation suddenly became a place where people were fighting simply to stay alive. Survival itself became a terrifying memory. Those who escaped physically unharmed still carried the psychological wounds of that night. Many survivors would remember the sound of gunfire. The sight of people running. The moment when a normal evening turned into chaos. For them, September 4, 1977, was not just a date in history. It was the moment when safety disappeared. The massacre also affected an entire community. Chinatown was a neighborhood where people often knew each other. News traveled quickly. Families worried about friends. Business owners worried about customers. Parents worried about their children. The attack created fear that reached far beyond the walls of the Golden Dragon. Many residents had already been aware of gang tensions, but the massacre showed that no one could assume they were protected from the violence. The conflict had crossed a line. A private war between gangs had become a public tragedy. And perhaps the most painful question was the one that many people asked afterward. Why them? Why did ordinary people have to pay the price for a conflict they had nothing to do with? That question has no simple answer. The victims were not chosen because of who they were. They were chosen by chance. They were victims of timing, location, and the reckless actions of people who had convinced themselves that revenge mattered more than human life. This is one of the most tragic patterns in gang violence. The people who suffer most are often not the people who started the conflict. The original enemies survive. The innocent people disappear. The Golden Dragon Massacre was supposed to be a message from one gang to another. Instead, it became a message about the devastating consequences of violence. It revealed what happens when anger becomes more powerful than compassion. When loyalty becomes more important than morality. When a person begins to see others not as human beings, but as obstacles or symbols in a larger conflict. The victims had no opportunity to explain themselves. No opportunity to fight back against the accusations, hatred, or revenge that brought violence to their door. They were not part of the story the attackers wanted to create. But they became the most important part of the story that history remembers. Because every true crime case is ultimately about people. Not just suspects. Not just investigations. Not just evidence. People. The victims remind us that behind every tragedy are lives that mattered. The 5 people who died inside the Golden Dragon were more than victims of a massacre. They were family members. Friends. Co-workers. Neighbors. They had memories that others carried forward. They had people who loved them. They had futures that should have continued. But on that September night, those futures were stolen. And while the city would spend years searching for answers, while investigators would chase suspects and prosecutors would argue in court, one truth would remain impossible to ignore. The greatest tragedy of the Golden Dragon Massacre was not that 2 gangs fought a war. It was that innocent people were forced to become casualties of it. They entered the restaurant expecting a meal. They left behind a legacy of loss. And their stories became a permanent reminder of the human cost of revenge. The early morning hours of September 4, 1977, began like many other nights in San Francisco's Chinatown. The city was quieting down, but Chinatown had its own rhythm. The streets did not completely sleep. Restaurants remained open late, serving customers who arrived after work, travelers searching for food, and residents who were not ready for the night to end. Behind the glowing signs and narrow streets, life continued. Inside the Golden Dragon restaurant, there was no sense that history was about to be made. No one inside knew that a deadly decision had already been made somewhere else. No one knew that a group of young men was moving toward them with weapons. No one knew that the conflict between 2 gangs, a conflict that had grown for years, was about to enter their lives in the most violent way imaginable. The Golden Dragon was filled with ordinary people. Customers sat at tables, eating and talking. Workers moved through the restaurant, carrying plates and completing another long shift. Some people were preparing to leave. Others were still enjoying their meals. It was a normal scene. A scene that could have happened in any restaurant in any city. But outside, a different story was unfolding. The members of the Joe Boys had made their decision. They believed members of the rival Watching Gang were inside the restaurant. To them, this was not a random location. It was a battlefield. The anger that had built after years of rivalry, the death of Felix Huey, and the constant cycle of retaliation had reached its breaking point. They were not thinking about the strangers inside. They were thinking about revenge. They were thinking about reputation. They were thinking about sending a message. That was the mindset that carried them toward the Golden Dragon. The group had prepared for the attack. They brought powerful weapons. Among them were a .45 caliber Commando Mark III rifle, 2 12-gauge shotguns, and a .38 special revolver. These were not weapons for intimidation. These were weapons designed to cause destruction. The attackers also used a stolen vehicle, planning an escape after the shooting. Every detail showed preparation. This was not an accidental confrontation. It was an organized act of violence. But what happened inside the restaurant would become far more devastating than even the attackers may have imagined. Because violence rarely stays within the boundaries people create in their minds. The attackers may have entered believing they understood exactly what they were doing. They may have imagined a controlled strike against specific enemies. But once weapons were raised and bullets began flying, control disappeared. At approximately 2:40 in the morning, the attackers entered the Golden Dragon. Their faces were concealed. Their weapons were ready. For the people inside, there was no warning. No opportunity to understand. No chance to prepare. One moment, they were customers and workers inside a restaurant. The next moment, they were trapped in a nightmare. The first reaction for many people was confusion. The human mind struggles to process sudden danger. A loud sound. A movement. A moment of uncertainty. People do not immediately understand that their lives are in danger. Some witnesses later described the chaos of those seconds when reality changed. People looked around trying to understand what was happening. Then fear took over. The attackers opened fire. The sound of gunshots shattered the restaurant. The carefully planned revenge attack became a wave of terror. Customers dropped to the floor. Some tried to hide behind tables. Others ran toward exits. People screamed. Chairs moved. Dishes fell. The restaurant that had been a place of conversation and food became a place of panic. The attackers were not facing their intended targets in a private confrontation. They were surrounded by civilians. But the shooting continued. The bullets moved through the room without discrimination. They struck whoever was in their path. A person sitting at a table. A worker performing a routine task. Someone who had simply chosen that restaurant at that moment. The tragedy was not only in the violence itself. It was in the complete separation between the reason for the attack and the people who suffered from it. The gunmen came looking for gang members. They found ordinary people. Yet ordinary people became the ones who paid the price. Within less than a minute, more than 20 rounds were fired. 60 seconds. That is all the time it took to change dozens of lives forever. 60 seconds for families to lose loved ones. 60 seconds for survivors to experience memories they would carry for the rest of their lives. 60 seconds for a neighborhood to realize that the violence it feared had finally reached its heart. The attackers eventually stopped firing and fled. The silence that followed must have felt unreal. A few moments earlier, the restaurant had been alive. Now, it had become a scene of destruction. People who were still alive tried to understand what had happened. Some searched for friends. Some looked for family members. Some tried to help those who were injured. In moments like these, people often act on instinct. A person who was terrified moments earlier may suddenly become someone trying to save another life. The human response to tragedy is complicated. Fear, shock, confusion, compassion. All of these emotions existed inside the Golden Dragon after the shooting. But for some families, those moments became the beginning of unimaginable grief. The victims who died that night had no connection to the gang conflict. They had no role in the rivalry between Joe Boys and Wat Ching. They were not part of the revenge that brought the attackers there. Their only connection to the tragedy was that they were present. That simple fact would haunt investigators and the community for years. The attack had failed in the way the attackers claimed to want. The watching members they intended to kill were not among the dead. The supposed enemies survived. The innocent victims did not. The violence that was meant to demonstrate strength instead revealed something else. It revealed recklessness. It revealed how quickly revenge could destroy lives beyond the people involved. It revealed the danger of believing that violence could solve a conflict. The Golden Dragon Massacre became a symbol of everything wrong with gang warfare. Because the people who started the conflict were not the only ones affected by it. A war between groups rarely stays between groups. It spreads outward. It reaches families. It reaches communities. It reaches people who never knew they were standing near a battlefield. After the attackers escaped, the reality of what had happened began to settle in. The restaurant was no longer simply a place in Chinatown. It had become a crime scene. The names of the victims would soon be known throughout the city. The investigation would begin. The search for the gunman would begin. The questions would begin. Who planned the attack? Who pulled the triggers? Who knew about the operation? Could it have been stopped? But before the investigation, before the courtroom, before the search for justice, there was the immediate human tragedy. 5 people were gone. 11 others were injured. And a neighborhood that had already struggled with hidden violence was forced to face the truth. The war between the gangs had finally reached innocent people. The Golden Dragon Massacre lasted only moments. But its consequences would last for decades. Because some events are measured not by how long they last, but by how deeply they change the people left behind. And on September 4, 1977, 60 seconds were enough to change Chinatown forever. The first moments, after the gunfire stopped, were filled with something almost impossible to describe. Silence. Not the peaceful silence of an empty street late at night. A different kind of silence. The silence that follows something so shocking that the human mind struggles to understand it. Inside the Golden Dragon restaurant, a place that had been filled with ordinary conversations only moments earlier, everything had changed. The tables, the chairs, the dishes, the walls, the people who remained standing, everything became part of a terrifying scene that investigators would later spend months trying to reconstruct. For those still alive inside the restaurant, there was no immediate understanding of what had happened. People were trying to process the impossible. A few seconds earlier, they had been eating dinner, talking with friends, or finishing their work. Then suddenly, violence had arrived without warning. The attackers were gone. But the fear remained. Some survivors looked around searching for familiar faces. Others tried to help the wounded. In those first moments, nobody was thinking about evidence. Nobody was thinking about investigations or courtrooms. They were thinking about survival. They were thinking about finding someone they loved. They were thinking about whether the person next to them would breathe again. Outside the Golden Dragon, the reality of the attack began spreading through Chinatown. Emergency calls brought police officers and medical responders rushing toward the scene. For the first officers arriving, the sight inside the restaurant confirmed the seriousness of what had happened. This was not a simple disturbance. This was not a robbery gone wrong. This was a deliberate attack. The officers entering the Golden Dragon were walking into one of the most shocking crime scenes San Francisco had experienced. The restaurant became a place where every detail mattered. Every object could provide information. Every witness could hold a piece of the truth. Every recovered bullet could help explain what happened during those 60 seconds of chaos. Investigators immediately faced a difficult reality. The attackers had planned the assault carefully. They had concealed their identities. They had arrived with weapons. They had escaped. There were no obvious suspects waiting at the scene. Only questions. Who were the gunmen? How many people were involved? Were they professional criminals or angry gang members acting on revenge? And most importantly, who were they trying to kill? That final question would become one of the central points of the investigation. Because investigators quickly realized that the people who died were not the intended targets. The attackers had entered the Golden Dragon looking for members of the Watching Gang. But the victims were mostly ordinary customers and workers. This changed the entire direction of the case. The police were not investigating a simple gang shooting. They were investigating a massacre. A crime where innocent people had been caught in the middle of a conflict they never entered. The physical evidence inside the restaurant began telling its own story. Investigators examined the location of the victims. They studied where the bullets had traveled. They recovered spent ammunition. They analyzed the weapons believed to have been used. Each piece of evidence helped create a timeline of what happened. The crime scene revealed the attack had been quick and violent. The gunmen had not remained inside for long. They had entered, fired, and escaped. The speed suggested they had a plan. They knew what they intended to do. But the result was something far beyond what they claimed to be trying to accomplish. The investigation also depended heavily on witnesses. But this was one of the greatest challenges facing police. Chinatown was a close community. Many residents knew about gang activity. Many understood the danger of speaking openly. Fear was powerful. Some people worried about retaliation. Some were afraid of becoming targets. Others may have believed that cooperating with authorities could bring more trouble than safety. This created a difficult environment for investigators. They needed information from the community. But the community had reasons to remain silent. For years, some residents had learned to survive by avoiding attention. They kept their heads down. They focused on their families and businesses. They did not involve themselves in conflicts between gangs. But the Golden Dragon attack forced many people to reconsider that silence. 5 people were dead. The violence had reached a level where staying quiet no longer felt like protection. The investigation became a major priority for the San Francisco Police Department. The city could not ignore what had happened. The Golden Dragon massacre had not only taken lives. It had shaken public confidence. People wanted answers. They wanted to know who was responsible. They wanted to know why a restaurant full of civilians had become a target. Authorities began focusing their attention on the long history of conflict between Chinatown gangs. The names Joe Boys and Watching immediately became central to the investigation. Detectives knew that the attack was likely connected to the ongoing rivalry. They began looking into recent events, especially the killing of Joe Boys member Felix Huey earlier that summer. His death had created intense anger within the group. Investigators believed the Golden Dragon attack may have been retaliation. A revenge mission. A response to one death that caused even more deaths. The investigation started to reveal a painful pattern. The massacre was not an isolated explosion of violence. It was another chapter in a cycle that had been growing for years. Detectives began identifying possible suspects connected to the Joe Boys. Names began appearing. Connections began emerging. The investigation moved deeper into the world of gang relationships, alliances, and rivalries. But identifying a possible motive was only the beginning. Police still needed evidence. They needed proof. They needed people willing to talk. They needed to connect individuals to weapons, planning, and the actual attack. The pressure was enormous. The city wanted justice. The families of the victims wanted answers. The community wanted to know whether another attack could happen again. For investigators, the Golden Dragon case represented a difficult challenge. Gang cases often depend on information from inside the criminal world. But people inside those worlds often follow their own rules. Silence. Loyalty. Fear. These barriers could protect suspects. And they could prevent justice for victims. As detectives continued their work, one thing became clear. The Golden Dragon massacre was not going to be solved simply by examining the crime scene. The answers were hidden in the relationships, conflicts, and decisions that existed before the shooting. The restaurant was only where the tragedy happened. The real story began long before the gunman walked through the door. It began with years of rivalry. With young men searching for power. With anger passed from one person to another. With a belief that revenge could restore lost honor. The bullets inside the Golden Dragon revealed the final moment of that conflict. But investigators now had to uncover everything that led to it. Who planned the attack? Who supplied the weapons? Who knew the targets? Who decided that innocent lives were an acceptable price for revenge? The answers would not come easily. The investigation would take patience, persistence, and courage. And as police searched through Chinatown's hidden world, they would discover that the path to the truth was filled with secrets, fear, and people who knew more than they wanted to admit. The Golden Dragon restaurant had become the beginning of the investigation. But the real hunt for the killers was only starting. The morning after the Golden Dragon massacre, San Francisco woke up to a reality that many residents of Chinatown had hoped they would never face. The violence that had existed quietly in the shadows had finally stepped into the light. For years, many people in the neighborhood had heard rumors about gang conflicts. They knew there were rival groups fighting for influence. They knew some young men were involved in criminal activity. They knew certain names carried fear and certain places carried danger. But the shooting at the Golden Dragon was different. This was no longer a conflict happening somewhere far away. It happened inside a restaurant. It happened in front of ordinary people. It happened to people who believed they were safe. The city demanded answers. The families of the victims demanded answers. And the police knew they were facing one of the most complicated investigations in San Francisco's history. The first challenge was understanding exactly what had happened. The evidence inside the Golden Dragon told investigators that this was a planned attack. The attackers had not arrived by accident. They had brought multiple weapons. They had chosen a location. They had entered with a specific purpose. But the most important question remained. Why? Who were they trying to kill? And why were innocent people the ones who died? Detectives quickly focused on the ongoing war between the Joe Boys and Watching. The history between these two groups was already known to law enforcement. For years, officers had been aware of tensions between rival factions inside Chinatown. The conflict had created shootings, assaults, and retaliations. The names of the gangs were familiar to investigators who worked in the area. But the Golden Dragon attack represented a new level of violence. It was one thing for gang members to attack each other. It was something entirely different to walk into a crowded restaurant and open fire. The investigation began moving through the complicated network of Chinatown's underground world. Detectives interviewed witnesses. They examined relationships between gang members. They studied previous conflicts. They looked for any connection between the attack and recent events. One event immediately stood out. The death of 16-year-old Felix Huey. Felix had been a member of the Joe Boys, and was killed during a shootout at the Pingyuan housing complex on July 4, 1977. To investigators, his death appeared to be the possible spark behind the Golden Dragon attack. The timing was significant. Only 2 months separated his death and the massacre. The pattern was familiar. A member of one gang dies. The other side demands revenge. The retaliation creates more victims. The cycle continues. But proving that connection was another matter. A suspected motive was not enough. Police needed evidence that could survive in court. They needed to identify the people involved. They needed to prove who planned the attack, who participated, and who was responsible for the deaths and injuries. This was especially difficult because of the culture of silence surrounding gang activity. Many people in Chinatown knew something about the violence. Some knew the names of individuals involved. Some knew rumors before police did. But knowing something and being willing to say it were two different things. Fear was a powerful force. People worried about becoming targets. They worried about retaliation from gangs. They worried about putting their families at risk. For some witnesses, silence felt safer than cooperation. Investigators understood this reality. They were not simply investigating a crime. They were entering a world where trust was difficult to earn. The detectives had to build relationships with people who had learned not to trust outsiders. They had to convince witnesses that speaking could bring justice rather than danger. Slowly, information began to emerge. The investigation started narrowing toward members of the Joe Boys. Police believed the attack was not carried out by random criminals. It involved individuals connected to the gang. The suspects were young. Some were teenagers or barely older. That reality made the case even more disturbing. The attackers were not experienced criminals operating with years of planning. They were young men caught inside a violent culture where loyalty to a group had become stronger than respect for human life. But investigators did not view their age as an excuse. The consequences were real. 5 people had died. 11 others had been injured. Families had been destroyed. The responsibility for those actions had to be determined. As detectives continued their work, they began identifying possible participants. The names of several Joe Boys members surfaced during the investigation. Among those eventually connected to the case were Tom Yu, Chester Yu, Dana Yu, Peter Ng, Peter Chung, Curtis Tam, Cam Lee, and Don Wong. Each name represented another piece of the puzzle. But investigators still had to answer difficult questions. Who entered the restaurant? Who fired the weapons? Who planned the operation? Who knew that civilians could be harmed? The investigation became a battle against time. In cases involving gangs, suspects often communicate through hidden networks. Evidence can disappear. Witnesses can change their stories. People can become afraid. Police needed to move carefully but quickly. The pressure increased as the public demanded action. San Francisco officials wanted to show that a crime of this magnitude would not go unanswered. The massacre had damaged the sense of security in Chinatown. Residents wanted to know whether another attack could happen. Business owners worried about the impact on the neighborhood. Families wondered whether their community was becoming more dangerous. Authorities responded by increasing attention on gang activity. The Golden Dragon case became a symbol of a larger problem. It was no longer only about one restaurant. It was about how a neighborhood could be affected when violence between small groups was allowed to grow unchecked. As detectives worked deeper into the case, they began reconstructing the night of the shooting. They examined the movements of suspects. They studied connections between gang members. They compared information from witnesses. They followed every lead, even those that seemed uncertain. Some leads went nowhere. Some possibilities turned out to be wrong. Like many major investigations, progress was not a straight path. There were moments of frustration. Moments when answers seemed close but disappeared. Moments when investigators had to return to the beginning and look again. But slowly, the picture became clearer. The Golden Dragon Massacre was beginning to reveal its origins. It was not a random act of violence. It was a revenge attack connected to the long-running feud between two rival gangs. And the people behind it were not strangers. They were individuals who had lived within the same community that was now mourning. That fact made the tragedy even harder to accept. The killers were not outsiders who had invaded Chinatown. They came from within the same environment. They knew the streets. They knew the neighborhood. They understood the fear their actions would create. Yet they moved forward anyway. The investigation was entering its next stage. Police had suspects. They had a possible motive. But they still needed the evidence that would connect those suspects directly to the massacre. The difference between suspicion and justice was proof. And finding that proof would require the investigators to uncover the final pieces of a deadly puzzle. The road ahead would lead them through secret meetings, hidden loyalties, and the complicated relationships inside Chinatown's gang world. Because solving the Golden Dragon Massacre was not only about finding who fired the bullets. It was about understanding the chain of decisions that brought those bullets into the restaurant. And the people responsible were about to discover that the walls of silence surrounding the gangs were beginning to crack. For the investigators working on the Golden Dragon Massacre, the hardest part of the case was never understanding what had happened. The crime scene had already told them that. They knew a group of armed men had entered the restaurant. They knew the attack had been planned. They knew the gunmen were searching for members of the watching gang. They knew innocent people had died. The real challenge was proving who was responsible. In the days and weeks after the massacre, detectives found themselves facing the same obstacle that had complicated many gang investigations before. Silence. Chinatown was a close-knit community. Generations of families had built their lives there. Neighbors knew each other. Businesses were often family-run. People shared information within their own circles. But that closeness also created fear. Many residents understood the unwritten rules of the streets. Do not ask too many questions. Do not involve yourself in gang conflicts. Do not become a target. For years, some people had survived by staying invisible. The police could offer protection. They could promise justice. But fear was not something that disappeared simply because investigators asked for cooperation. The people who knew the truth often had reasons to keep it hidden. Some feared retaliation from gang members. Some worried about being labeled a traitor. Some believed that speaking to police could make their lives more dangerous, not safer. For investigators, every conversation required patience. Every interview required trust. Every piece of information had to be carefully examined. Because in a case involving gangs, not every statement was reliable. Some people exaggerated. Some people protected friends. Some people provided false information. The detectives had to separate truth from rumor. But slowly, the investigation began to move forward. The focus continued to return to the Joe boys. The motive appeared increasingly clear. The attack was likely connected to the death of Felix Huey, the 16-year-old Joe Boys member killed during a July 4th shootout. To the gang, Felix's death represented humiliation and loss. But investigators saw something different. They saw a chain reaction. A young man's death had triggered anger. Anger had turned into planning. Planning had turned into violence. And violence had taken the lives of people who were never part of the conflict. The police began building a picture of the events leading up to September 4th. They believed the attackers had received information that members of the Watching Gang were inside the Golden Dragon. That information was crucial, because it showed that the massacre was not random. Someone believed the restaurant contained their enemies. Someone made the decision to act. Someone gathered the weapons. Someone organized the attack. The investigation started moving from the question of who was there to the deeper question: who made this happen? As detectives continued interviewing witnesses and gathering intelligence, they began identifying individuals connected to the operation. The names of several Joe Boys members emerged. The suspects included Tom Yu, Chester Yu, Dana Yu, Peter Ng, Peter Chung, Curtis Tam, Cam Lee, and Don Wong. But identifying suspects was only the beginning. The police needed to establish their roles. In a criminal investigation, association is not enough. Being connected to a gang does not automatically prove involvement in a specific crime. Investigators needed a direct link between the suspects and the massacre. They needed evidence showing preparation. They needed evidence showing participation. They needed evidence showing intent. The breakthrough came when investigators were able to connect the attack to members of the Joe Boys organization and develop a clearer understanding of the group's actions before and after the shooting. The investigation revealed that the massacre was not the work of one person acting alone. It was a group decision. A collective act of violence. And that made the crime even more disturbing. Because responsibility was not limited to the person who pulled the trigger. It extended to everyone who helped create the situation that led to the deaths. The case demonstrated one of the most difficult realities of gang violence. A group can make individuals feel stronger than they are alone. Inside a gang, responsibility can become blurred. A person may convince themselves that they are only following orders. That they are protecting their friends. That they are proving loyalty. But when the consequences arrive, the victims do not disappear. The damage remains. The Golden Dragon attack had created 5 funerals. It had injured 11 people. It had traumatized an entire community. The investigation was forcing everyone involved to confront the reality of what had happened. The young men who planned the attack may have believed they were fighting a war. But the people they harmed were not soldiers. They were neighbors, workers, customers, human beings. As police gathered more information, arrests began. The suspected members of the Joe Boys were taken into custody. For the city, the arrests represented hope. For the victims' families, they represented the possibility of answers. But for investigators, the work was not finished. An arrest was not the same as justice. A courtroom would still have to determine responsibility. Evidence would have to be presented. Witnesses would have to speak. Prosecutors would have to explain not only what happened, but why it happened. The Golden Dragon case had become more than a criminal investigation. It had become a public examination of gang culture, revenge, and the cost of violence. The city wanted to understand how a group of young men could walk into a restaurant and commit such an act. The answer was not simple. There was no single moment that created the tragedy. There was no single decision that explained everything. There were years of conflict. Years of anger. Years of people believing that violence was the only way to restore respect. The massacre was the final result of many smaller choices. And that was what made it so tragic. Because the shooting lasted less than a minute. But the decisions that led to it had been building for years. When the suspects were finally identified, the investigation moved into a new phase. The mystery of who was responsible was beginning to disappear. Now came the harder question. How would justice respond? Could a courtroom explain the damage caused by 60 seconds of violence? Could a sentence restore what had been taken? Could any punishment truly represent the pain of families who lost loved ones? Those questions would follow the case into the courtroom. But before that happened, the investigators had accomplished what many thought might never happen. They had broken through the silence. They had uncovered the connection between the Joe Boys and the Golden Dragon Massacre. And they had brought the accused face to face with the consequences of their actions. The war between gangs had begun on the streets. But now, the final battle would take place somewhere else. A courtroom. A place where evidence would replace rumors. Where witnesses would tell their stories. Where the survivors and families of the victims would finally have the chance to speak. And where the people accused of creating one of San Francisco's darkest nights would have to answer for what happened inside the Golden Dragon. The streets of Chinatown had been filled with questions for months. Who was responsible? Why did it happen? Could the tragedy have been prevented? But after the arrests connected to the Golden Dragon Massacre, those questions moved from the streets into a courtroom. The place had changed. The fear and confusion of that night inside the restaurant were replaced by something different. A courtroom is a place where every detail must be examined. Every accusation must be supported. Every piece of evidence must be challenged. For the families of the victims, it was a place where they hoped to finally understand how their loved ones were taken from them. For the accused, it was the moment when the consequences of their decisions would begin to unfold. The Golden Dragon Massacre was no longer only a tragedy remembered by a community. It had become a legal battle over responsibility, intent, and justice. The prosecution faced a difficult task. They had to explain not only what happened inside the restaurant, but what had brought the attackers there. They needed to show the connection between the Joe Boys and the attack. They needed to prove that the shooting was not a random act of violence. It was planned. It was deliberate. And it was connected to the ongoing war between rival gangs. The prosecution's argument centered around one undeniable fact. The attackers had entered the Golden Dragon with weapons and a purpose. They were not reacting to an unexpected confrontation. They were not defending themselves. They had gone there because they believed their enemies were inside. Their target was the watching gang. But the people who suffered were innocent. This distinction became one of the most important elements of the case. The defense could argue about intention. They could discuss whether the attackers specifically wanted certain individuals dead. But the prosecution argued that entering a crowded restaurant with firearms and opening fire created an obvious and deadly risk. The victims did not have to be the intended targets for the crime to be devastating. The decision to shoot in a place filled with civilians carried consequences. The courtroom became a place where the tragedy was reconstructed piece by piece. The events of that night were examined carefully. The weapons. The planning. The gang rivalry. The movements of the suspects. The testimony of witnesses. Every detail became part of the larger story. For survivors and families, hearing those details again was painful. Trials often force people to return to the worst moments of their lives. A memory they tried to escape becomes something they must revisit. The sound of gunfire. The panic inside the restaurant. The moment they realized someone they knew would not survive. The courtroom required them to experience those moments again. But their voices were essential. Without witnesses, many criminal cases involving gangs can collapse. Fear can protect criminals. Silence can hide the truth. The willingness of survivors and witnesses to speak helped bring the events of September 4, 1977, into public view. They transformed a crime scene into a story. Not the story the attackers wanted to tell. A story about the people who were harmed. A story about the cost of violence. A story about the families left behind. The prosecution also emphasized the larger issue behind the massacre. This was not simply a shooting. It was the result of gang culture and revenge. The attack represented a dangerous belief that violence could solve conflict. That harming others could restore lost pride. That fear could create respect. But the courtroom revealed the reality of that belief. Violence did not restore honor. It created victims. The young men involved had wanted to send a message to their rivals. Instead, their actions sent a message to the entire city. Gang warfare does not remain between gangs. It reaches innocent people. It destroys communities. It creates pain that lasts long after the weapons are gone. As the case moved forward, the defendants faced serious charges, including murder, attempted murder, conspiracy, and assault with deadly weapons. The severity of the charges reflected the seriousness of what had happened. 5 people had lost their lives. 11 others had been wounded. A neighborhood had been traumatized. The justice system now had to determine the responsibility of each person involved. Not every participant necessarily played the same role. Some may have helped plan. Some may have participated directly. Some may have provided support. The court had to examine each person's actions and level of involvement. This process was important because justice required more than anger. It required evidence. It required fairness. It required separating emotion from legal responsibility. For the families of the victims, however, no verdict could truly repair what had been taken. A prison sentence could not bring back a loved one. A courtroom decision could not erase the memories of that night. Justice could punish those responsible. But it could not reverse the tragedy. That is one of the hardest realities in cases like the Golden Dragon massacre. The legal system can answer questions about guilt. It can assign punishment. But it cannot restore lost lives. The people who entered the restaurant that night expecting an ordinary meal would never return to their normal lives. Their families had to continue without them. Their friends had to remember them without being able to see them again. The community had to carry the memory of what happened. The verdicts and sentences became part of history. Several members of the Joe Boys received lengthy prison terms for their involvement. The courts recognized the seriousness of the attack and the devastating consequences of their actions. The punishment reflected the belief that even when violence begins as a gang conflict, the responsibility extends beyond the intended targets. When a person chooses to participate in an armed attack in a public place, they also accept the possibility that innocent people will suffer. The courtroom had delivered its judgment. But the story of the Golden Dragon massacre was not finished. Because some cases continue long after the legal process ends. They remain in the memories of communities. They remain in the stories told by survivors. They remain in the questions asked by future generations. What causes young people to join violent groups? How does anger become more powerful than empathy? Why do people believe revenge can bring peace? The Golden Dragon case became an example of the destructive nature of retaliation. One death led to another. One act of violence created another. The people seeking revenge believed they were answering injustice. Instead, they created a tragedy that was far greater than the one they believed they were avenging. The courtroom proved that responsibility could not disappear behind the word revenge. A person cannot erase the consequences of their actions by claiming they were fighting for loyalty or honor. Because real people were hurt. Real families suffered. Real lives ended. Years after the verdicts, the Golden Dragon Massacre remained one of San Francisco's most painful reminders of what happens when violence is allowed to grow unchecked. The courtroom had closed one chapter. But Chinatown still had to live with the aftermath. The empty chairs. The memories. The questions. The loss. Justice had answered who was responsible. But the community was left with a deeper question. How could something like this happen in the first place? And that question would continue to shape the way San Francisco remembered the night when the hidden war inside Chinatown became impossible to ignore. The courtroom doors eventually closed. The verdicts had been delivered. The suspects had been convicted. The legal process that followed the Golden Dragon Massacre had reached its conclusion. But for the people of Chinatown, the story did not end there. A trial can determine guilt. A sentence can punish those responsible. But neither can restore what was lost. The morning after the massacre, Chinatown was not the same neighborhood it had been before. The streets looked familiar. The buildings remained standing. The restaurants continued serving customers. The signs still hung above the sidewalks. But something had changed. A sense of innocence had disappeared. For many residents, the Golden Dragon Massacre became proof that the violence they had hoped would remain distant had reached directly into their community. For years, gang conflicts had existed beneath the surface. People heard rumors. They saw signs. They understood that certain groups were fighting. But many believed ordinary people could avoid becoming part of that world. The attack destroyed that belief. The message was painful. Violence does not always stay where it begins. A conflict between gangs can enter a restaurant. It can reach a family. It can find people who never knew they were involved. The victims' families carried the deepest wounds. For them, the Golden Dragon Massacre was not a historical event. It was a personal tragedy that continued every day. Every birthday that passed. Every holiday without their loved one. Every family gathering where an empty place remained. The world moved forward. But their lives had been permanently divided into two parts. Before September 4, 1977. And after. The families had to deal with a kind of grief that is especially painful, because it comes with unanswered questions. There is grief after a natural death. There is grief after illness. But there is a different kind of pain when someone is taken through violence. The mind searches for explanations. Why did this happen? Why were they there? Why did someone decide their life was worth less than a gang message? Those questions often have no satisfying answers. The victims had no connection to the conflict that killed them. They were simply present when someone else chose violence. That reality made the tragedy even harder for the community to accept. The Golden Dragon Massacre also changed how San Francisco viewed gang violence. Before the attack, some people saw these conflicts as internal disputes between criminal groups. A problem that belonged only to those involved. But the massacre showed that this was a misunderstanding. Gang violence does not exist in isolation. It affects neighborhoods. It affects businesses. It affects families. It affects everyone who shares the same streets. The shooting forced city officials and law enforcement to confront the growing problem of gang activity in Chinatown. The police response became more focused. Gang investigations received greater attention. Authorities recognized that traditional approaches were not enough. Understanding the community became essential. Officers needed cooperation from residents. They needed trust. They needed people to believe that reporting crime would lead to protection rather than danger. The tragedy also encouraged community leaders to speak more openly about problems that had previously been difficult to discuss. For some residents, there had been a feeling that exposing internal problems could damage the image of Chinatown. Many communities struggle with this dilemma. They want to protect their reputation. They do not want outsiders to define them by crime. They do not want the actions of a small number of people to represent everyone. But silence can also allow problems to grow. The Golden Dragon Massacre forced Chinatown to confront a painful reality. Ignoring violence does not make it disappear. The neighborhood had to acknowledge the existence of gang problems, while also defending the identity of the larger community. Because Chinatown was not defined by gangs. It was defined by the millions of ordinary moments that happened every day. The families running businesses. The elderly residents walking familiar streets. The children growing up between cultures. The workers who spent their lives building something better for the next generation. The massacre belonged to the criminals who caused it. It did not belong to the entire community. That distinction was important. The attack could have allowed fear to define Chinatown. Instead, many residents chose resilience. They continued living. They continued working. They continued protecting the culture and community they had built. But the memory remained. The Golden Dragon became a symbol. Not only of violence, but of the consequences of violence. It became a reminder of what happens when young people become trapped in cycles of revenge. When loyalty to a group replaces responsibility to humanity. When the desire for respect becomes more important than the lives of strangers. Looking back at the Joe Boys and watching conflict, one of the most tragic elements is how young many of the people involved were. Many of those connected to the gangs were teenagers or young adults. They were at an age when people are still developing their understanding of the world. They were making choices that would follow them forever. The tragedy was not only the lives lost inside the Golden Dragon. It was also the realization that an entire generation had been pulled into a destructive environment where violence became normal. The attackers believed they were defending their group. They believed revenge would restore balance. But revenge rarely creates balance. It creates another wound. The death of Felix Huey led to retaliation. That retaliation led to the deaths of innocent people. Those deaths created more suffering. The cycle continued. And the final result was a tragedy far greater than the original conflict. The Golden Dragon Massacre became one of the clearest examples of how violence expands beyond its original purpose. A person may believe they are targeting one enemy, but their actions can destroy the lives of many people who had nothing to do with the conflict. That is what made the case so painful. The victims were not chosen because of who they were. They were chosen by circumstance. They were casualties of someone else's anger. Decades later, the massacre remains part of San Francisco's history. It is remembered as one of the city's deadliest episodes of gang-related violence. But remembering the case is not only about remembering the attackers. It is about remembering the victims. It is about understanding the community that suffered. It is about recognizing that behind every crime statistic are real people. The Golden Dragon restaurant was once simply a place where people gathered. A place for meals. A place for conversations. A place for everyday life. After September 4, 1977, it became something else. A reminder. A place connected forever to a moment when violence entered an ordinary room and changed everything. The tragedy of the Golden Dragon Massacre was not only that 5 people died. It was that their deaths came from a conflict they never chose. They were not part of the war. They were not participants. They were not enemies. They were people. And that is why the story continues to matter. Because beneath the investigation, the arrests, and the courtroom battles, the central truth remains unchanged. The greatest victims of violence are often the people who never had a reason to be afraid. They were simply living their lives. Until someone else's hatred found them, the Golden Dragon Massacre was not born in the 60 seconds when bullets crossed the restaurant. It was born long before that. It began in the minds of people who slowly accepted the idea that violence was an acceptable answer. It grew through years of rivalry, fear, pride, and anger. By the time the gunman entered the Golden Dragon restaurant, the most important decisions had already been made. The weapons had already been chosen. The target had already been selected. The emotions that pushed them forward had already taken control. To understand the tragedy, it is necessary to look beyond the crime itself and examine the psychology behind it. Because the Golden Dragon Massacre was not simply an act of violence. It was the result of a mindset. A mindset where revenge became more important than reason. Where loyalty to a group became more important than the lives of strangers. Where young men convinced themselves that causing pain was a way to regain respect. This is one of the most dangerous patterns found in gang conflicts. Violence rarely begins with someone believing they are evil. Instead, it often begins with a person believing they have a reason. They believe they have been disrespected. They believe they have been attacked. They believe they must respond. The danger comes when that belief becomes stronger than empathy. When a person begins to see revenge not as a choice, but as an obligation. The Joe Boys and Watching conflict developed within this environment. The two groups were not simply competing. They were locked inside a cycle where every injury demanded an answer. Every attack created another reason for retaliation. Every death became a symbol that required revenge. This kind of thinking is common in environments where reputation becomes connected to survival. Inside gang culture, weakness can be dangerous. A person who refuses to respond to an insult or attack may be viewed as powerless. A group that does not retaliate may appear vulnerable. This creates pressure. The individual is no longer making decisions only for themselves. They are making decisions based on how they believe the group sees them. In that environment, violence becomes a form of communication. A shooting is not only about hurting someone. It becomes a message. It says, "We cannot be challenged. We will respond. We are powerful." But the tragedy is that these messages often create the exact opposite result. Instead of creating respect, they create fear. Instead of ending conflict, they create more conflict. Instead of restoring honor, they create suffering. The death of Felix Huey became a turning point in this cycle. To the Joe Boys, his death represented loss and humiliation. At only 16 years old, Felix became a symbol of what they believed had been done to them. The emotional response was not only grief. It was anger. And anger, especially inside a group environment, can become dangerous. When people experience loss, they often search for someone to blame. They want an explanation. They want someone responsible. But in gang conflicts, that search for responsibility can quickly become a desire for punishment. The question changes from, What happened? 2. How do we make them pay? That transformation is where revenge begins. Revenge creates the illusion of control. It tells people that if they hurt the person who hurt them, the pain will somehow become balanced. But violence does not erase loss. It only creates more loss. The attackers who entered the Golden Dragon believed they were targeting their enemies. They believed the people inside represented the group they hated. This reveals another psychological process that often appears in group violence. Dehumanization. When people become symbols instead of individuals, it becomes easier to harm them. A person is no longer seen as someone with a family, memories, and dreams. They become the enemy. A label. A target. A representation of everything the group dislikes. This is how ordinary moral boundaries can begin to disappear. The attackers were not thinking about the strangers sitting at tables. They were thinking about the people they believed they were fighting. The innocent victims became invisible in their minds. But reality does not disappear simply because someone refuses to see it. The people inside the Golden Dragon were not symbols. They were human beings. They had families. They had responsibilities. They had futures. The psychological distance created by gang thinking allowed the attackers to ignore that reality until it was too late. Another important factor was group pressure. Violence committed by a group can become easier than violence committed alone. When several people participate, responsibility becomes divided. A person may think, I was only following. I was only helping. I was not the one who decided. But a crime like the Golden Dragon Massacre is created by many decisions. Someone chooses the target. Someone provides weapons. Someone organizes the plan. Someone drives the vehicle. Someone enters the building. Someone pulls the trigger. Each action contributes to the final outcome. Group involvement does not erase individual responsibility. In fact, it can make violence more dangerous because members may encourage each other to go further than they would alone. Fear decreases. Confidence increases. The presence of others can create a sense of protection. A person may do something in a group that they would never do by themselves. This phenomenon is often seen in gang violence. The group identity becomes stronger than personal morality. The individual begins thinking as part of the group instead of as an individual. The question becomes, what does my gang expect from me? Rather than, what is right? The Golden Dragon Massacre demonstrates the devastating result of that shift. A planned attack against specific rivals became a massacre because the people carrying out the violence failed to recognize the humanity around them. They entered believing they were fighting a war. But wars have consequences. And in this case, the battlefield was a restaurant filled with civilians. The psychology of revenge also explains why conflicts like this can continue for years. Each side sees itself as responding, not initiating. One side says, we attacked because they attacked us. The other side says, we attacked because they attacked us first. The cycle becomes impossible to break because everyone believes they are the victim. Everyone believes their actions are justified. Everyone believes they are responding to someone else. Until the final result is tragedy. The Golden Dragon Massacre became the moment when that cycle reached its most devastating point. The attackers wanted revenge for one death. Their revenge created 5 more deaths. They wanted to prove strength. Instead, they exposed weakness. Because true strength is not measured by the ability to destroy. It is measured by the ability to stop destruction. The tragedy of the Golden Dragon was not only about what happened inside the restaurant. It was about the years of decisions and beliefs that made such an attack possible. It was about a culture where fear replaced respect, where revenge replaced justice, where young people were drawn into conflicts that offered identity but demanded destruction. And perhaps the most painful lesson from the case is this: violence always promises a solution, but it rarely delivers one. The person seeking revenge believes they are ending their pain. Instead, they create new pain. The enemy they wanted to punish survives. The innocent people they never considered become victims. And the person who commits the violence must carry the consequences forever. The Golden Dragon Massacre was not just a crime committed with weapons. It was a crime created by a way of thinking. A way of thinking that transformed anger into action. A way of thinking that allowed hatred to become stronger than humanity. And in the end, it was not the gangs who paid the greatest price. It was the people who never belonged to the fight at all. Nearly half a century has passed since the night the Golden Dragon restaurant became the scene of one of the darkest moments in San Francisco's history. The streets of Chinatown have changed. New businesses have appeared. New generations have grown up. The city itself has transformed in countless ways. But the memory of September 4, 1977, remains. Because some tragedies do not disappear with time. They become part of the identity of a community. They become stories passed from one generation to another. They become reminders of what happened when violence entered a place where people believed they were safe. The Golden Dragon Massacre was not only a crime. It was a turning point. It forced San Francisco to confront a reality that many people had not fully understood. Beneath the beauty and tradition of Chinatown existed a struggle involving gangs, young people searching for belonging, and conflicts that had been allowed to grow for years. Before the massacre, many outsiders viewed Chinatown through a simple image. A historic neighborhood. A tourist destination. A place filled with restaurants, markets, and cultural traditions. But the shooting revealed another side. It showed that behind the familiar streets were social problems that could no longer be ignored. The tragedy forced the city to ask difficult questions. How did young people become involved in violent groups? Why did gang conflicts continue to escalate? What could be done to prevent another tragedy? These questions were not easy to answer. Because the Golden Dragon Massacre was not caused by one single factor. It was the result of many forces coming together. Social pressures. Identity struggles. Economic challenges. The desire for belonging. The need for respect. The influence of street culture. The cycle of retaliation. Each factor created another piece of the puzzle. And together, they created an environment where violence became possible. For law enforcement, the massacre changed the way gang activity was viewed. The attack demonstrated that gang violence was not simply a problem between criminals. It was a public safety issue. When gangs fought, entire neighborhoods could suffer. The police response became more focused on understanding the structure of these groups, their relationships, and the reasons young people were drawn into them. Investigators recognized that arresting individuals after violence occurred was not enough. The deeper problem was preventing the conditions that allowed violence to grow. Community leaders also faced difficult choices. Chinatown had always been a community that valued privacy and self-reliance. Many immigrant communities share this experience. People who have faced discrimination or hardship often develop strong internal support systems. They rely on family. They rely on neighbors. They solve problems within the community. But the Golden Dragon Massacre showed that some problems could no longer remain hidden. Silence could protect a community from unwanted attention. But silence could also protect the people causing harm. The tragedy encouraged more conversations about youth crime, gang prevention, and community safety. It forced people to acknowledge that protecting a neighborhood did not mean pretending its problems did not exist. It meant confronting those problems. It meant creating opportunities for young people before they were pulled toward destructive paths. It meant helping future generations understand that respect cannot be built through fear. The story of the Golden Dragon also became a warning about the consequences of revenge. The attackers believed they were responding to an injustice. They believed violence would restore balance. But the result proved the opposite. Their actions created more victims. They caused suffering far beyond their original conflict. The people they wanted to punish survived. The innocent people, who had nothing to do with the rivalry, paid the highest price. This is the tragedy at the center of the Golden Dragon massacre. The people responsible believed they were fighting for something. But in the end, everyone lost. The victims lost their lives. The families lost loved ones. The community lost its sense of security. The attackers lost their freedom and their futures. A single night of violence damaged countless lives. Over time, the Golden Dragon massacre became part of the broader conversation about gang violence in America. It became an example of how conflicts between small groups can have consequences far beyond those directly involved. It showed that violence does not remain controlled. A person may believe they know exactly who will suffer. But violence has its own path. It reaches people who were never part of the original conflict. It reaches families. It reaches communities. It reaches history. The massacre also changed the way many people viewed the victims. Too often, stories about violent crimes focus on the perpetrators. The names of suspects appear in headlines. Their actions become the center of attention. But the Golden Dragon story is ultimately about the people who lost their lives. The workers who went to earn a living. The customers who went out for a meal. The families who expected their loved ones to come home. Their lives were not defined by the tragedy. They were defined by everything that came before it. The moments they shared. The people they loved. The contributions they made. The memories they left behind. Remembering victims is important because crime can sometimes reduce people to statistics. 5 deaths. 11 injuries. 1 massacre. But every number represents a human story. Every victim had a world that existed beyond that night. The Golden Dragon massacre remains powerful because it reminds people of that truth. Behind every crime scene is a human cost. Behind every headline is a family. Behind every statistic is a life. The restaurant itself became a symbol. Not because of the violence that happened there, but because of what that violence represented. It represented the dangers of allowing hatred to grow unchecked. It represented the consequences of treating human lives as part of a rivalry. It represented the moment when a hidden conflict became impossible to ignore. Years later, the questions surrounding the massacre still remain meaningful. Why do people join groups that encourage violence? Why does revenge feel powerful even when it creates more suffering? Why do people sometimes sacrifice their own futures for a moment of anger? These questions extend beyond Chinatown. They apply to communities everywhere. The Golden Dragon massacre became more than a local tragedy. It became a lesson about human behavior. About the choices people make. About the consequences those choices create. Because the most frightening part of the case is not only that violence happened. It is that the violence developed slowly. It grew from smaller conflicts, from unresolved anger, from repeated decisions that seemed insignificant until they created something irreversible. The shooting lasted less than a minute, but its impact lasted decades. That is the true legacy of the Golden Dragon Massacre. Not the weapons, not the gang names, not the headlines. The legacy is the reminder that ordinary people can become victims when hatred is allowed to grow. The legacy is the memory of those who never had a chance to escape. The legacy is the understanding that revenge does not bring justice. It only creates more people who need justice. And perhaps the final lesson from that night in 1977 is the simplest one. A community is not measured only by the violence that happens within it. It is measured by how it responds afterward. San Francisco responded by remembering, by investigating, by learning, by refusing to let 5 innocent lives become forgotten. The Golden Dragon Massacre remains a painful chapter in Chinatown's history. But it is also a reminder of something more important. Behind every tragedy are people worth remembering. And sometimes the greatest way to honor them is not only to remember how they died. It is to remember that they lived.